Hey guys, welcome to another movie review. Today I'm going to be talking about the new documentary feature film, Won't You Be My Neighbor? This is a documentary about Fred Rogers, the man behind Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. He was the creator, he was the star, he was the man that kind of made that show possible. Outside of Sesame Street, I would say Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood is probably the most, if not the most, successful educational show for kids that was possibly ever made. Um, I remember watching it as a kid. I was probably one of the later generations to experience Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I grew up around the '90s, so that was around the time where it was still going, but it was kind of at the end of its run. I think even Fred Rogers himself passed away in the early 2000s somewhere. So I was definitely in the later generations of people who did experience Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, but it was at the kind of the tail end of it. I was lucky enough to probably experience some reruns of it back in the day. But anything, I guess, wherever the show was at in the '90s was kind of what I experienced with it. But I do remember it having a huge impact. I remember a lot of kids really liked it. I was one of those kids. I remember going over to somebody's house after preschool, watching it a lot. Um, Fred Rogers has had a different way of looking at things. He had a very educational way of looking at things. I think that's why a lot of parents liked their kids watching a lot of his material too. He just had a different way of looking at things. It was very interesting to watch him on TV. So in this "Won't You Be My Neighbor" documentary, it focuses on people who knew him, people who grew up with him, people who actually were on his show, people who were even involved with Fred Rogers before Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood became a thing. They talked about a show he was involved with when television was still kind of in its early stages, and he kind of had the puppeteering task of the show and stuff like that. So they go over kind of how some of the things that you even see in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood kind of happened by accident at an earlier time in his life, and because that earlier accident was so successful, he used it in his own show, and it was a success as a result because he knew it was a success from an earlier time of his life. So just all this stuff was covered throughout Won't You Be My Neighbor, and it was a very interesting documentary. So for my positives and negatives, and this is why I'm jumping in right away, because a lot of the really good things I liked about the movie are in my positives of the movie too. So for my positives and negatives of the movie is I like how Mr. Rogers encouraged the right to be individual. He really pushed everybody to be their own individual self. He said it as a he or as a boy a lot, but I think he was also in for it for the girls too. He definitely was not just in it for the young boys. He was in it for the young girls too. Like his messages were universal to all children and universal to kind of everybody in a way too. But I liked how he encouraged the right to be individual. He really wanted everybody to be the self that you always envisioned yourself to be. So whether that means you wanted to be a doctor or engineer or a construction worker, he encouraged you to really go after those things, to really not make sure that any outside sources is kind of a changing your opinion on that. He really encouraged you to be your own individual self. And I think that's what I really liked about Fred Rogers is he really encouraged people to be that way. I also liked in this movie how it shows the uniqueness of Fred Rogers and his love for the nonviolence. He really didn't like where TV was at before he joined it. He really thought there was too much clowns and slapstick and violence and overly science fiction-y shows on TV, and he really didn't like that. He wanted to have a show for kids that really was just kind of about everyday life and about educating young kids about how to properly water flowers in the garden or how to get ready for your day or how to work electronics at home. And he wanted his show to really be about that. He really wanted it to be just kind of a slice of life, kind of like what The Simpsons did with Matt Groening did that, kind of a slice of life, more educational side of slice of life kind of a show. And I loved how the film really showed that he really didn't want any kind of violence in his show. He really wanted a non-violent show for kids. So that's really what he wanted his show to be. And he really wanted to be unique and stand out in front of everybody else. And so he had communication techniques and way of talking to kids that was interesting and really kind of different from everybody else. I also loved how the movie really showed that he could reach out to kids and teach kids like no other person. It's one thing to have a really good teacher. It's another good thing to, like, let's say, have a Sesame Street show where they teach you things, they educate you things. But Sesame Street, I think, was more so in for the fun of things. They wanted kids to have fun watching it. Not to say that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood didn't want that. I thought Fred Rogers, in the way the movie the way that the movie depicts this too, is he really wanted to reach out to kids and teach them. So just in case you didn't really have that kind of parental figure or that teaching figure in your life to teach you those things, he was going to kind of be that person to teach you those things through the television. So I really liked how he had this ability with people too. Mr. Rogers is also one of the few people to really use silence as a gift. So, like, let's say he was teaching how to use an egg timer. He would really use that 1 minute of silence to show you how long a minute on an egg timer would look like. So his use of silence, I thought, was very unique. I even remember watching the show as a kid too. His use of silence really was quite unique. Like, even if his show was transitioning from something he was doing over to the puppet show, I think it was like King Friday the 13th or something like that was the name of the puppet. So like when the trolley was transitioning over to the puppet show part, there really was pretty much silence. Besides the trolley moving around, you really didn't hear a lot of things. Maybe there was an occasional musical number or two, but for the most part, it was pretty silent until the next thing happened. Or like I said, if he was using an egg timer, he would really use that full minute to his advantage to show you what that looked like and stuff like that. So his use of silence, I thought, was very effective in his show, and so the documentary reflects this very well also. There was also some tiger animation transitions between plot points and between things that were covering in the movie, and I really liked it a lot. The tiger in the animation sequences was very similar to the tiger puppet he was using on the course of his show and things like that. So I like the use of transitions in this documentary. And most importantly, I've seen a lot of people bring this up about the movie too, and it really is kind of important to our real world. We almost kind of wish we had a Fred Rogers around right now because of this thing. But Fred Rogers was known for taking on real world issues. So, like if 9/11 was happening, which was kind of the last big historical thing he covered before he eventually passed away, but he also covered the JFK assassination, the assassination of JFK's brother. He covered, kind of how violence was getting out of control at one point. He covered at one point, and even used his African American co-star to kind of bring this point across. He didn't like how on the news how African Americans were treated badly, how this hotel owner was splashing, he was throwing this like bleach liquid thing into the pool to get these African Americans out of it. And so, because Fred Rogers was so angry about that, he had a whole segment on his show about how he invited this African American man over to his place. And this guy was a regular on his show, so it wasn't completely out of the blue for this. But basically, he was watering his feet with cold water because it was a hot day, and he invited this man along to kind of put the cold water on his feet too, since he was a police officer, at least on the show he was. And kind of encouraged him to do this with him. So there was things like that he did to kind of cover real world issues. And he even had a little puppet that there was even a person who was on his show who was saying with the puppet that he was talking about the assassination thing and was talking about how people mattered. And so there was even one point in the show where he was trying to talk about how it's really important that people don't commit suicide and stuff like that. So he really brought in these things that nobody would dare cover on a children's show, and he found a way to either communicate it with puppets, communicate it with himself, or communicate it on his King Friday the 13th portion of his show. And so I really liked how the film covered how he took on these real world issues, and he really had his own voice in kind of covering these things. But for my negatives of Won't You Be My Neighbor, I thought some of the archive footage that was used in this movie, specifically, I would say before Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood started up, some of the really, really old, maybe home footage that was used to cover in this movie, some of the archive footage to me personally was really overly grainy. And the reason why I bring this up as a negative is, let's say you're watching this film on Blu-ray or 4K Ultra HD, that's really not going to look good on your TV. Like I said, some of this old archive footage really is very grainy. They didn't really restore it very well for this movie. So I thought that was one thing they could have done, is found a way to restore it a little more. Sure, maybe keep a little bit of the grain and stuff like that. But I thought some of the archive footage just felt a little too overly grainy. And when you're watching this on a big screen like I was in a movie theater, that's not going to come off too well. There's also some really slow moments in this movie. There's a lot of points where, in between some of the major plot points of this documentary, they really kind of were running out of material in certain portions, I thought. So as a result, certain moments of this film feel a little too slow for their own good. I also would have liked to have seen more scenes that focus on the modern impact of Fred Rogers. Sure, they covered the stuff when he was around, so let's say, I don't know, maybe 2003 to when he made his debut on television. I would say all of that was covered perfectly, but I would say post death Fred Rogers really wasn't covered that much. They kind of covered kind of the memories and kind of what people still take away to this day about Fred Rogers, but I would have liked to have seen more of a modern impact of what Fred Rogers did to, let's say, the kids who weren't around when Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood was still showing new episodes, or to kids that maybe have heard about it and maybe show a clip on YouTube or something. I just really would have liked to see more of a modern impact that Fred Rogers made, rather than just people kind of who knew him and, after his death happened, that was just kind of the end of it. So overall, Won't You Be My Neighbor, I'm going to give this film a 9 out of 10. I think it's a very well-made documentary. It certainly gives Fred Rogers a lot of respect, and if you haven't had a lot of respect for him before this movie, you're definitely going to have a lot of respect for him after seeing this movie if you really don't know what he was doing and stuff. But like I said, some of the overly grainy archive footage I thought could have been restored better. There's some really slow moments that really kind of drag every once in a while. And I really would have liked to have seen more scenes that had a modern impact about Fred Rogers. I really would have liked to have seen kind of how people felt about Fred Rogers, let's say in 2016, 2017, 2018. I think that really would have made the film really have that extra punch at the end. So, Won't You Be My Neighbor? 9 out of 10 for me. I really like this documentary a lot. I encourage you to see this movie. Like I said, it's not a perfect documentary, but for what it was trying to do, I thought it accomplishes its goal very, very well.